finished my dissertation in March of '72, worked for the remaining 6 months of my time at UCLA on the demonstration project that Bob Kahn was organizing for this International Computer Communications Conference. At the same time that Bob finished the demo, he went on to ARPA.
I decided to work on other aspects of networking. In 1973, or thereabouts, there were only these large time-sharing computers. So you weren't going to take them around with you, even in a Jeep or a truck.
You know that the computers are going to have to be in aircraft, they have to be in ships at sea, they have to be in mobile vehicles. And you have to use radio or satellite to communicate because you can't have wires dragging behind everything.
We pursued a packet radio net, so we actually created a packet satellite net on Intelsat 4, linking the US research community with a number of researchers in Europe. The challenge was to figure out how to make them work together.
And I left UCLA to go to Stanford University, so he came out to Stanford in, I would say, the spring of '73, described what the problem was. And of course, I was instantly fascinated by, gee, how can you get these different kinds of packet nets to work? So we spent the next 6 months just working back and forth to figure out what the architecture would have to be, or at least what its properties would have to be. And by September or so, we now have a sort of the base paper, and I start recruiting graduate students to flesh out the details of what this protocol had to look like. Eventually, we called it the Transmission Control Protocol, and it took us through the end of calendar 1974 to write the first complete spec. It was published as RFC 675. It referred to Internet Transmission Control Protocol. It was the first time the term Internet had been used.
Seeing that poll, forgive my language, I kind of get the feeling that the only reason that inadequate scored so high is because you weren't given an option called shitty. So, okay, let's hear it for the shitty vote there, boy. So we've heard a lot today about Moore's Law version of the internet, that it's always bigger, it's always getting better. But this panel, Has True Innovation Stalled, will give us a sense of how big and how contentious this subject is. And you will know this when I tell you that Len Kleinrock is putting himself in the middle of it, and he's calling himself not the moderator, but the referee. Gloves on.
Thank you, Pat. This is a different format. This is a debate. We're going to have two debaters out here on the topic, Has True Innovation Stalled? Which is a wonderful topic. And I'm going to introduce the two speakers, and I'm going to step aside. I'm going to let them do it. I'm going to hopefully say nothing unless it's necessary to protect. So the first one, Bob Metcalfe. Bob Metcalfe is a true internet pioneer. You can thank Ethernet for him. And appropriately, he's a professor of innovation at the University of Texas at Austin. And then we have Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal. Funder of young entrepreneurs, encouraging them to think deeply and to create new technology, and author of the best-selling book, 0 to 1, an amazing popular book. So gentlemen, we're going to start off. Peter's taking the supportive side of innovation has stalled, and guess, Bob, you're going to take the opposite side. So I'm going to step aside, but not too far, and let you guys go at it.
All right, well, thank you so much for hosting this incredibly important discussion on many different topics we have. I think one of the most important questions we can always ask about our society is how fast is it progressing, how much is it progressing? We live in a world where people measure Avogadro's number, the fine structure constant in physics, things like this, to many significant digits. But when we talk about the nature, the rate of progress. Is it accelerating, decelerating, stalled? We tend to revert to just the most hand-waving sort of generalities, and we often end up with just these short, emphatic statements that it's accelerating or stagnant. And yet I think it's very important to try to drill down on this very important question a little bit more. My general thesis is that since the 1970s, innovation broadly has stalled. The world of atoms has been slow. The world of bits has continued. There's been a narrow cone of progress around computers, internet, mobile internet, software, the world of bits. But the world of atoms has stalled out very badly. And so if you were to go back 50 years and look at this from the point of view of 1969, people would have defined technology as not just computers, but also supersonic aviation, rockets, underwater cities, pharmaceuticals, the green revolution of agriculture, plastics, all sorts of different dimensions of progress, that it was advancing on many different fronts. That was the expectation of the world circa 1969. Today, technology, the word technology itself, has been narrowed to information technology because this is the only thing that we see progressing. And of course, there have been these pockets in Silicon Valley around some of the bigger tech companies that have been quite dramatic. But I always think that in many ways, one of the things the internet, that these iPhones are doing is they're distracting us. And one of the things they're distracting us most importantly from is our surroundings and how strangely unchanged our surroundings are. And so if we were to look just outside this hall today, one of the things we would notice would be there are all these fires burning in California. And from the point of view of 1969, the expectation would be that we would have had developed all sorts of technologies to control the environment. We'd have better firefighting technologies. We certainly would have figured out ways to bury transmission lines. And we're in a world where we can't even control the fires. We're going backwards. People are going to have less electricity. And we're not even noticing this because we're stuck glued to our cell phones all the time. And we're in this world where things are stalled out. And so I think there is, there's always this narrative people in Silicon Valley have where it's this breathtaking progress. So it's university researchers, venture capitalists. Always people like to talk about how great they are, how much progress they've been making, how wonderful they are. And it doesn't resonate in the economic data, in sort of the cultural experience. For the people who are Gen X, millennial, younger, the way our generations experience things is that life is less good than it was for the boomers. Salaries are stagnant. It's harder to get to the same standard of living as it was in the 40, 50 years ago. And this is why we have, for the first time ever in this country, the expectation that the young generation will do less well than their parents. And this is a dramatic fact that's completely at odds with the sort of breathless propaganda from Silicon Valley that we get all the time. And it doesn't show up in the economic numbers, it doesn't show up in the productivity data, and so I think we need to take this thesis very seriously, that things have been stalled for some time, and we can hope that it's about to accelerate, but the default is that it's been stalled for 50 years, and we need to find a way to get back to the future. Thank you.
Great.
Why does he have two microphones and I only have one?
I think this technology broke down.
Well, this morning there was some bias in the room. Professor Kleinrock stood at that podium and said that 50 years ago he did the queuing theory that explained packet switching. But since then, there have only been baby steps along the way leading to the dark side. So I'm outnumbered here, 2-1. So true innovation is not stalled. That's just an illusion. Of course, we have to look at these words, true. So true must be the opposite of baby steps, so it must be big. And innovation, well, it's not just science, and it's not just engineering, but it's having impact on society with new knowledge, I suppose. And then stalled, you mean, well, you've answered that question. You could say stalled today because we're all at this conference, not innovating. Or it's stalled this year, or it's stalled. So we can play with those definitions. Instead, I'd like to share with you my model of innovation, which begins to explain why you and I would disagree about anything. The goals are freedom and prosperity.
All right.
I was surprised I didn't get much response on that one.
Say it again.
Okay, freedom, the goals are freedom and prosperity. And innovation is the process that links them together and drives the virtuous cycle. That's what innovation is. So you take this big function, innovation, and you apply a Fourier transform. And what you get is a lot of little spinning innovations that add up to the big innovation. And they all have their own frequencies and amplitudes and phases. And many of them, including the ones that you and I inhabit, have two phases, or two cycles, or two phases. One is the platform deployment phase, and then the second phase is the platform exploitation phase. And it turns out that I'm a platform developer and you're a platform exploiter. I don't mean that in a negative way.
This is getting nasty.
So the reason that you think we're stalled is because we're going through my phase. And your phase, I can't wait to see what you're going to do with the next phase. When the next platform is, you're not allowed to say anything. When the next platform is ready, you're going to do the same thing, I hope, or even better to the next platform that you just finished doing to the past platform. Now, these platforms that you and I inhabit have a special quality. It's called special ingredient, connectivity. So connectivity, which we're celebrating here today, connectivity is a thing. It has its own physics, and it has its own math, and it has its own disruptions, its own pathologies, its own... it's a thing that's worthy to just study in and of itself, connectivity. The pathologies are the dark side. I have a list of them here somewhere. The list of the pathology. Oh, I've lost my list. Anyway, I can enumerate. Porn. And we've handled that. No, that's a done deal. There were no more porn on the internet. And then there was spam, which you heard about. That's a pathology. And then hate speech and eventually false news, fake news. And those are pathologies that have risen up because this connectivity has come on us so fast. That is, in only 50 years, only 50, we have suddenly have 4.4 billion people on the internet, 55% of the human race. And last year it grew 9%, so it's not as if it's slowing down. And I argue that this connectivity has come suddenly and we're still dealing with it. So a lot of the pathologies will go away like porn did, because we will handle them. The bad news is, or not bad news, the other news is the next platform is already upon us. That is, we're still struggling to deal with what might be called the megabit internet, but now we have coming the gigabit internet, or let's call it the augmented video, mobile, gigabit internet of things. Here it comes. So we barely digested the connectivity of the previous wave of connectivity, and now we have the next wave coming. And I can't wait to see what you're going to do with it. Thank you.
All right.
Well, I guess the question I would have is, why can't we do all these things in parallel? Why can't we be developing a whole bunch of different platforms at once and exploiting them, roughly in parallel or in short succession? Why does it have to just be one thing at a time? And I will concede to you that the connectivity revolution is enormous, the internet is enormous, and it's oddly been the only game in town for something like a quarter of a century in Silicon Valley. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the late 80s, I thought that I was going to go into biotech. And I'm glad I didn't. That would have been a catastrophic mistake. I mean, there were some things that happened. For the most part, it's just a smidgen relative to the internet revolution. It was one thing. And the macroeconomic question is, how valuable is connectivity relative to all these other things? So if you have an app that says you have a larger chance of getting cancer because that's what we've done based on the big data and looking at 1 billion other people, that's somewhat valuable. On the other hand, I would actually like to have, if you have a choice between an app and a cure for cancer, I'd rather have the cure for cancer, which was the war on cancer we declared in 1970, and it was supposed to be won by 1976. And so there are sort of all these other areas that are stalled out. And like maybe to frame this, in a university context, I think we're often told that STEM is the future: science, technology, engineering, math. And I always think STEM is a giant lie, because the only two STEM fields where you can expect to get a well-paying job upon graduation are computer science and petroleum engineering. And everything else doesn't actually work. You can putt around in grad school for a decade earning slave wages or something like that, but it doesn't actually lead anywhere. If you're in physics, chemistry, these are hard fields. There are no jobs, there are no applications. It's not generative. When I was at Stanford in the late 80s, it wasn't obvious at the time, but in retrospect, every engineering field would have been a bad one to go into. I think electrical engineering was still sort of working in the 80s, but mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, all these things were bad ideas. Aeroastro, that was over. Nuclear engineering, certainly people by the 80s knew you shouldn't go into that, but almost every engineering field wasn't working. And so an accelerating technological civilization would be one in which STEM fields across the board would have application, would lead to successful careers, and they really don't. I often think the people who major in the humanities are better off than the people majoring in STEM, because if you major in something like English or something like that, you at least know there will be no job for you at the end. And whereas you have to be a scientist to be so deluded as to think you'll be taken care of by the natural goodness of the universe.
I learned recently that the two best petroleum engineering departments in the world are at the University of Texas and Stanford. That should be surprising. But let's go back. By the way, when I took the Fourier transform of the big innovation swirl, I didn't mean to suggest you couldn't pursue them in parallel, so that I think there's a little misunderstanding there. You can, and we are. And there are some metrics. So I looked up a few things, metrics purported to be metrics of innovation. And so, for example, patents, useful, novel, not obvious. And it turns out in 2018, there were 3.3 million patents filed worldwide, up 5.2%, up. And for the 9th year in a row, up. So that's, if one could argue that patents are a measure of innovation, well, there's some up data there. It's not stalled, it's going up. Although with that data, I ran into some other data which surprised me. The United States is not the #1 patent filer. China is, 1.5 million patents. We only produce 600,000. Oh, that was interesting. GDP, it's estimated that 10% of the US GDP is attributable to the internet, and 4% of the jobs. I can come up with the sources later. The poverty rate is in decline. In fact, there's this great chart that shows the connectivity chart of the internet, which, as you know, goes like this with a steep rise right here in around 95. There is a similar sort of growing graph of extreme poverty, and just as the internet arrives, it nosedives right down like this. So according to the U.S. Census, so the number of people who are poor in the United States and also the world is now acceleratingly downward, and correlated with the arrival of the internet. And then when you look at the number of democracies in the world, freedom and prosperity, since 1990, the number of democracies has gone from 40 to 100, and the number of autocracies has gone from 100 to 80. So that seems like progress. And
all these stats, we'd have to drill down on them so much. Like, I don't think the poverty stats in the U.S. are down that much. I think, yes, democracies are better relative to 1990 when the Cold War ended. Relative to 2005, it's gone backward the last 15 years. So all these things are, a little bit more complicated when we drill down on it. But I think one thing I want to just differentiate very sharply is technological innovation from globalization. These are two very different things. And so the fact that a goat herder in Burkina Faso has a cell phone and maybe gets a malaria net from the 19th century, they're better off. Well, let's concede that. But the question of innovation is fundamentally a question for the developed world. Are our countries getting dramatically better off? And that's where things feel very stalled. So I think if you're in Bangladesh or Burkina Faso, things feel like they've gotten better in the last 20, 30 years because there is a certain convergence. But convergence is not the same as innovation. We talk about in the 50 years ago, we would talk about the first world and the third world, where the first world was technologically accelerating, the third world was permanently screwed up. Today we talk about the developing and the developed world. The developing world is a world that's copying and catching up to the developed world, so that's a globalization frame. But the developed world, when we say the US or Western Europe or Japan are parts of the developed world, we're implicitly saying that these are the places where there's no innovation, that things have stalled out, and that they're developed, they're done, we're finished.
I hate to give data on your side, but the only two major countries whose patent filings went down was the United States and Japan, by the way. Now, federal R&D spending, and incidentally, on this data, I have only drilled down far enough to make my point. So, since 1976, federal R&D spending in constant dollars went from $80 billion to $150 billion. And just this year, it was signed into law that we're going to enter in research $1.3 trillion out of the federal, up 12%, 12.8% from last year. So there's an effort to fund the science and engineering that might underlie innovation, so I took those as hopeful signs. Now, you talked about atoms. So there's a list of things I've been able to glean here. So there is the gigabit internet, which I view as a form of innovation, but fusion. There's now 11 startups pursuing fusion. I think you would agree if we could have fusion, that'd be great.
Don't disagree with that.
Okay. Geothermal baseload, the DOE is ramping up its effort to mine heat. And in Texas, we know how to drill, and just drill a little deeper, and it gets really hot down there, and you can make energy with that. CRISPR, immunotherapy. Texas just got a Nobel Prize in that, immunotherapy. The lithium-ion battery and its descendants. Oh, we got another Nobel Prize in Texas for that one. Quantum computing, AI, reusable rockets. You have to admit, when Elon had those two rockets land like this, that was innovation, wasn't it?
Look, nobody's saying that there's zero innovation. The question is, how do we quantify this? And we have to, and this is like, it's not a straightforward thing to, how much do these different forms of innovation count for? How valuable are they? And how do we quantify them? And fusion would be very valuable. It hasn't happened yet. It's possible that even if we have it, it won't be allowed on a regulatory basis because maybe it gets treated the same way nuclear power. So that's you have a whole set of questions. How big are these things on a quantitative type basis? And the idea that I keep coming back to is the story. The incentive is always to tell a story about how wonderful we're doing. This is the grant money game in universities. This is the venture capital story. And so the story that it's accelerating is one that always gets told. The other one, we tend not to hear this much. I'll give a Nobel Prize-winning professor at Stanford story, Bob Laughlin, who's got a Nobel Prize in physics in the late 90s. And he suffered from the supreme delusion that once he had a Nobel Prize in physics, he would have academic freedom, and he'd then be able to do whatever he wanted. And so what he decided to do, and there are all sorts of things you could, of course, look into that are, probably, questioning climate change, or there are all these sort of things that, you're not supposed to look at. But Laughlin decided to look at something far more taboo. And he was convinced that most of his colleagues at Stanford were basically defrauding the government, sort of stealing money, engaging in fraudulent research. And he started to investigate the biology department, since he thought that they were full of people with probably bad math genes or something like that. And we can sort of predict how this movie ended, where as well. He got yelled at. His grad students couldn't get PhDs anymore. Laughlin himself got promptly defunded. It's sort of, and we all know that this is a question that you can't ask. What's the actual integrity of these sort of things? And that's why I'm not so interested in measuring inputs, dollars spent, patents. I'm more interested in measuring outputs. What are the results? How what is life expectancy going up? Why is life expectancy going down? Are people's is the economic output going up of the society? So again, these are not perfect measures, but you're trying to quantify outputs, and that's where something's very stalled. So we have the inputs seem to keep going up, the outputs are very badly stalled, and that's the opposite of technology. It's technology is doing more with less, and we're doing less with more.
So the University of Texas has a cancer hospital, MD Anderson, arguably the largest in the world. And they have a great logo, it has cancer in their logo, and then there's a red line through the cancer. And their whole rhetoric is, I'm paraphrasing, we don't do cancer research, we're trying to cure cancer. That's our mission and our job. I'm agreeing with you. So you were talking about corruption in the science world. Corruption.
Sure, you can call it various forms of that. Sure.
Non-reproducible results.
Sure.
And
we have the reproducibility crisis. But I think I wouldn't be that worried if there was some corruption and there was some misallocation if we had the breakthroughs. And that's sort of where are the breakthroughs that are transforming our economy, that are taking our civilization to the next level.
So take CRISPR. Why isn't that a breakthrough?
Well, it is. It's unclear when it's going to be applied. It was 20 years ago we already had the genomics breakthrough. So in the late 90s, you already read the genes. You had various companies that were formed. And 20 years later, we haven't even translated genomics into applied medicines yet. So that's taken wickedly long. And then, of course, with CRISPR, even some of the people who helped develop the CRISPR technology, are very vocal in saying it should never be applied. And so, it's the translation is hard, and it's probably impossible if even the researchers who develop it say, well, this is a really cool thing I discovered, but it should never be applied. This should never be. Nobody ever gets to try to monetize this or do something with it.
Did you see the articles about?
Let's hear from the audience now, if I may. First question, really, it's a big issue. If innovation is stalled, what can we do about it, if anything? We've heard about problems. Let's try to get solutions. I'll start with you, Peter.
Well, I always think I think it's overdetermined. The reasons why it's stalled out is a combination. It's gotten harder to find things. It's sort of screwed up political processes, excessive regulation. The piece that I would always lean on a policy level would be deregulation. I think one of the reasons there's been less progress in biotechnology than in computer science is because things are very heavily regulated. If you needed the FDA to approve every single video game every time it got made, and we had to see whether a video game was addictive, whether it damaged your brain or something like that, there'd be much less progress in video game technology, and perhaps that's one of the reasons things are so stalled in cancer and Alzheimer's. So my libertarian bias would be we should have a much less heavy-handed regulatory approach. And then I think the non-political answer I always give is that it is still always possible to do things in starting companies, in doing research, in funding things. And so even though the big picture, I'm frustrated at how challenged and how slowed it is, my day-to-day job, I try to figure out ways to help people work on things, and it's still possible for people to do things. There's always room for human agency, and we should never lose sight of that. So, but the political thing I would lean on would be much less regulation of technology and of innovation. And if you're, the polio vaccine would never get approved today. I think there were like a bunch of people who died. They were given overdoses when it first came out, and I think some of them got polio. And today it would just be shut down. Don't get to do that ever. And there's some balance, but the balance is way too far in the direction of crazed risk aversion and not doing anything new, being scared of your own shadow.
Since it's my position that innovation has not stalled, I don't need to come up with any
But
solution.
how would you improve it?
Well, was it when the rockets landed together? You know, Elon's rockets. Wasn't that cool? That was
That is really
atoms.
cool.
There was
That is really cool.
Lots of atoms and everything.
That is really cool. Although I'm good friends with Elon, but the frame on it, of course, is that Elon is the counterexample. It's like there was an Onion cartoon when Steve Jobs died, an Onion article when Steve Jobs died back in 2011, where it's this great tragedy. The one person who invented things in our country just died, and we don't know what we're going to do. And I think we also have Elon, but it's like a weird. It's a very weird thing where that's the go-to story. Is we have one person who helped develop electric cars and reusable rockets. And there's Elon, and then but if you tell a young person, why don't you be like Elon? It's a negative role model where the basic response is, well, that's too hard. I can't do that. You could maybe be like, you could start a consumer internet company from your college dorm room. There's sort of a version of that where the role model thing works. But Elon is terrific. His companies are great. The innovations have been great. But I think the cultural thing that's very odd is it functions as he actually functions as a negative role model. And it's because we've internalized the stagnation too much.
I toured South Africa last month, and I asked to be taken to Elon's birthplace. But apparently that's not a tourist attraction yet.
So I'll have a real question for you, Bob. This is a softball for you. How can we incentivize research that might not always be profitable? You're teaching students how to do innovative research. Are they plagued by going to profit, or are they doing things that are interesting, valuable?
Well, that's in the process that that I've been trying to perfect over the years. That question is confronted early, which is this idea likely to find a market or not? And there's a whole bunch of people specializing in I think they call it social entrepreneurship, and I send them over there because I only deal with for-profit companies, so they.
Well, that was clear.
And they're different. They're different. Well, there's two major differences. In a nonprofit company, you don't expect to repay your investors, and your customers don't have any money. Whereas in the for-profit world, it's a completely different challenge. So they're really like two different expertises.
So with that,
I strongly agree with Bob. My version of this is when you try to do well by doing good, you often end up doing neither. And so it's good to keep these two things very separate. There's room for profit, there's a room for nonprofits, but when you blend them together, you mostly get the worst of both, not the best of both.
so the altruism here is just dripping out of the sink. But my concern is that you guys have come together, and I want to hear your closing statements. So fight a little more in your closing statements. I'll start with you, Bob.
Well, I don't think innovation has stalled on any time frame or at almost any scale. Who was it who said they promised me flying cars, but all I got was...
We said that.
You said that? Yes. Yeah. That's consistent with your position, I might say. We're investing a lot in R&D. We are filing patents, which are evidence of innovation. We can make a list. I have one here of things like quantum computing and CRISPR, one of my favorite things. Immunology. There is some evidence that there's innovation going on there. So I don't think it's stalled. There's a room for improvement. I was just joking. Of course there's room for improvement. I'm very sensitive to what I call the corruption of science. I say science is the last refuge of a scoundrel. So we need to fix that. That'll help. And but entrepreneurship, which is one way of advancing innovation, is booming right now.
Peter?
Well, I think that again, there are a lot of different reasons for why things have stalled out. One explanation that's often given for the stall that I'll push back and end on a slightly more positive note is that often it's said, we've just simply run out of ideas. All the low-hanging fruit's been picked, all the easy ideas were discovered. And I always think that's sort of the nature explanation. I lean more on cultural nurture explanations. I think things are stalled because we haven't been trying as hard. And so it's a cultural question, it's a question of nurture, and that's why I think we can find a way back to the future. And it's really just up to us to find a way back and to start doing new things once again. We sort of have gotten into this 50-year cul-de-sac, this narrow zone around IT, and it is simply up to us to broaden it and to build companies, to do research, innovations in a wider range of things. Nothing wrong with Twitter, nothing wrong with 140 characters. I still like flying cars, and there's absolutely no reason we can't have them.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Well done. Very good, really great.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's weigh in. Has true innovation truly stalled? Our next poll question gives you a chance to respond to that. Any minute now. Can we have our next poll question, please? Okay, well, maybe we're not going to take it after all. Quick show of hands. Has innovation stalled? I believe that innovation is alive and well. Okay. Innovation has it, I think. Oh, here we go. All right. Okay, we are going to transition to our next session with the help of a little video.